Redline. No losses? Make as much as inflation, or make as much money as you can. How much pain can you take? Investors need to find out what their red line is and how it moves. The Redline Money podcast can help you find it. Redline Money takes the expertise of David Roach and Richard Harris as they talk markets, prices, bubbles and busts, and some even more interesting topics. David and Richard have nearly a century between them of searching for the red line in bull markets and bear. Hear what the crowd isn't saying about current markets and price moves in the long term and even longer. Back to the Egyptians. See markets as an engineering system, a biological organism, or as the behaviour of subatomic particles. You don't get this anywhere else, and you know it makes sense. So this week, the G7 finance ministers have been meeting in London, and just ahead of those meetings, the Secretary of State for the US, Antony Blinken, said that he doesn't see the US as being in a new Cold War with China. And now those meetings have concluded, we've had a communique suggesting that Russia and China are both perceived as threats. So I thought I'd ask you what your views on that are and what those threats may be.
I think the thing that struck me about the G7 communique was how completely toothless it was. It said China is naughty because it's bullying other nations with its economic power and, of course, weaponry, though it didn't actually mention that. And Russia, which can hardly bully anybody with its economic power because its economy is the size of Italy, is bullying people with its weaponry. But they didn't actually say they'd do anything about it, whereas these countries are extremely effective in what they're doing. As regards the Cold War, well, of course there's a Cold War between the United States and China. It extends to so many areas of high tech, for example, upon which, in my view, China depends. So it's been increasing. The temperature has been dropping in this Cold War for most of the year, most of last year. And in my view, it's going to go on dropping. So that was a nice euphemism for saying we want to keep the lines of communication open. We want to be able to pick up the phone and talk to you about things which we do have in common. But, do I believe Blinken that there's not a Cold War? No, I don't believe him.
Right. Richard, your thoughts?
No, or it's just a continuation of the old Cold War. Although, of course, the old Cold War between Russia and the US seemed to be a lot more ordered. There was a hotline. They could speak to each other. They could kind of look each other in the eye. Now there's almost a three-way split. I think it's much more confusing. Just reading the communique, there seem to be two levels. There's the kind of principled, quote, level of human rights, Taiwan, South China Sea, Ukraine, all of these issues that they're concerned about. But there's also a much more harder concern, I think, that the US has, and probably the Five Eyes as well, which is the element of aggression in areas like cyberspace, in influence in political affairs, in getting nationals within those countries to act in the interest of their, should we say, their home country rather than their adopted country. I think those are the kind of things that the communique was concerned about. And the difficulty is, how can the West, or certainly the US, deal with these things? Because they're much more ethereal and difficult to really focus on.
So then that's the next question, obviously, that follows on. What would you suggest the solutions are? How does the West deal with these? And what does it need to do? Why is it feeling so scared about this?
Because it's doing so badly. It has so few tools. I mean, the big things it can focus on, which it's having trouble focusing on, are issues like Taiwan. Let's take a minor issue, but it's on the edge of what Richard was saying, which is vaccine diplomacy. I mean, Russia has been highly successful in splitting the European Union. Not only Hungary, which you would expect to do anything maverick, which it can find to do under Orban, but states, individual Länder in Germany, are looking for Sputnik vaccines against the policies of the EU, against the policies of other states, such as France, and even the German federal authorities are looking for Sputnik vaccines. So Russia has managed to split the whole of the European Union, which God knows is a rich enough place and should have its own vaccines, but doesn't because of its incompetence. But then you go to the lesser developed countries, you go to the poor countries, and Russia and China are both stepping in highly successfully. Forget the Belt and Road Initiative for a minute. Just look at the potential for China to step into India and say, here's the vaccines free of charge, and can we have a little influence after the event?
So it's all about vaccine diplomacy.
No, just now.
At the moment.
At the moment, really.
There is that, but it also puts a finger on the reason why the West still has its nose ahead. The country, China, Russia, etc., are looking to be in a good second place. They've got these vaccines. They don't have the kind of level of scrutiny, and they won't give the level of scrutiny to see how good these things are. So yes, they can be tested in the third world. Maybe they'll be good, maybe they won't. Although, as we know with vaccines, at least if you have some of the vaccine, you're probably going to reduce the impact, in a more than proportional way. But I think the key point here is credibility, because clearly Western vaccines are well advertised.
It's very transparent, isn't it, how the process has been?
That's right. And I think that still counts for an awful lot. I mean, David and I were just looking at the foreign exchange figures, the foreign exchange held by countries, showing that the US is still way ahead of China. In fact, the US has increased, I think, in the last 18 months, the equivalent of 3 Chinas in terms of currency held by other people in reserves. Switzerland's increased. The yen has increased more than proportionally. And I think there's a real credibility issue that China and Russia really has to get over in winning over the third world. But they could be a very good second best, which is where the influence can be quite important.
I think that's right, but I don't think China wants to be second best. And I think the lesson from Putin is that I don't have to be second best. I mean, literally, I mentioned in the beginning, but it's worth bearing in mind that the GDP, all the output added together of Italy, is the same as Russia. But I think that because Russia devotes so much of its resources to military hardware and software, it is actually a world threat, whereas its economy does not substantiate that threat. In a sense, you could say the same for China. It's much, much more economically successful, but it still is very much a second place to the United States. But what you're saying is they'd be set to happy for a second place. I don't think that for a moment, Richard. I think that the economic power and the projection of geopolitical power, particularly of either thugocracies or dictatorships or autocracies or whatever you want to call them, they're not linked. They can close hospitals and open weaponries tomorrow morning. They really do not have this enormous limitation which is placed on a place like Germany, whereas if you buy or design another tank, you might lose office because people go back to when these tanks were used for not so nice purposes, which is of course buried in history forever. But the reality is that these countries are not going to settle for second place. They're going to settle for first place. Putin came from a bankrupt state to being the number 3 power on the world stage in a decade, while his economy did virtually nothing. So I think they're going to be more of a nuisance than you allow for.
So in what ways are they going to demonstrate this nuisance?
They're going to take on Taiwan, if you're talking about this part of the world. That, in my view, is an inevitability, and that'll be their major target. Then they'll take over places like Djibouti in Africa and all sorts of places in Africa that need a bit of infrastructure. But they will become, China in particular, and Russia too, will become increasingly isolated in terms of their integration into the world system. So you're talking about not only political fracturing of the world, you're talking about economic fracturing of the world, because the West, or the rich democracies, or whatever you want to call them, will probably put enormous strictures on their trade and economic integration. That's what I think the future is.
But what you're saying is that Russia and China are essentially going to look for advancement through military might.
Yeah.
Because, and my point about the second place is, obviously if you're good at second place, you've got a chance of being first. But the issue is one of credibility. And Africa is a big thing to bite off. Yes, maybe Djibouti may become a Chinese colony, but it's going to be very difficult for the Chinese to start colonizing Africa, because you need to get the hearts and minds. Yes, it does help to have military might, because that's the other part of the anatomy, which gets the hearts and minds to follow. But the hearts and minds, I think, still look at credibility. I remember when I was in Zimbabwe once, and we were told to bring old clothes, so we bought some very nice branded Marks and Spencer's T-shirts and things, 100% cotton. And they looked at these things and they said, these are old. And we say, oh, terribly sorry, that's what we were told. They said, no, but we get stuff from China, but it falls apart at the first wash. So there is a distinction, even in Africa, between the kind of credibility, the hearts and minds that win people, as opposed to pure military strength.
I'm Carolyn Wright, and I've been speaking to David Roach of Independent Strategy and Richard Harris of Port Shelter Investment Management. Music is by Tim Moore from Pixabay, and Redline Money is produced in Hong Kong.